We're on silent.
Yep.
So that's just private instead.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I can hear a little bit of background from some people, so if we could all just make sure that we're on mute, that would be great. Thank you for making the time this morning. My name is Ben Hawkins. I'm the Executive Manager of Policy and Communications at AMCA Australia. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all today and to introduce our speakers on this important topic of psychosocial hazards. Before I introduce our presenters this morning, I do just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, wherever it is that you find yourself today. For me, that is Gubbi Gubbi land in Queensland, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Like I said, today is a very important topic. It's something that I know has caused a lot of concern out there in the business community and the AMCA membership. So we're very, very fortunate to have a bit of a dream team of presenters today on this topic. We have Stephen White, who's a partner at McCullough Robertson. Stephen is an insurance and corporate risk expert with 20 years of experience in practicing in insurance-related matters, and Stephen will be speaking to the work cover component of this new requirement. Speaking first, though, this morning we'll have Cameron Dean, who's also a partner at McCullough Robertson Lawyers. Cam leads the workplace health and safety team and is recognised as one of Queensland's leading practitioners in this space. And also today we have Dave Shillington, who is a former Queensland Maroon, very timely given this week's game. But more importantly for the purposes today, Dave is the founder and coach at Prime Effect, which is an innovative health tech and services company that aims to improve the mental health and well-being of employees and drive productivity in doing so. So as you can see, that is a great lineup for a topic that is as complicated as this. And with that, I might hand over to you, Cam, to get things started.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And good morning, everybody. Hope your Tuesday's going well for you. This is a topic that is one that certainly in my area, which is specialising in the work health and safety side of things, garnered a lot of attention for people, particularly and curiously because of, I guess, really here in Queensland, the new code that kicked off earlier this year. So the purpose of today is to hopefully traverse some of the high points for people and to get an understanding of what we're talking about when it comes to managing psychosocial hazards, and obviously for Stephen giving some insights from the workers' comp side of things, because that's obviously an important component as part of talking about this type of topic. Stephen and I have delivered a lot of talks in this space over the last 6 months or so. So it's a one that we're well versed in. If people do have questions, I think we're just going to gather those up as we go through, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to get through some of those if we can. But ideally we'll answer your questions on the way through and not have to trouble you with that. And of course, we've got David. David's got a bit more of a hands-on insights, I think, in terms of some of these issues, which as lawyers we deal with some of those practical issues because we have to consider that as part of this type of framework. But the primary part around this is, of course, for us dealing with those legal aspects. So Ben, we might just jump onto the next slide. I think, as I've mentioned, there is this new psychosocial code that's come into play. One of the biggest challenges that I think we'll find in managing this type of issue, I'll probably break down into being, ignorance and apathy. And that is that, people either being completely unaware of what the requirements are, or the apathy side of things, which is, don't know, don't care type of approach. It's not really something that you can adopt when dealing with psychosocial risks, much like the physical risk side of things. When it comes to work health and safety, there is going to be this expectation that you'll be managing those things. why is it important to manage it? Why should you not be ignorant or apathetic about it? Well, Ben, if you just jump onto the next slide for me, I think you'll find, if you look at some of the data that's kicking around, certainly been studies that have been done for a long period of time, you'll find that most people that you encounter are going to have a mental health issue at some stage in their life, whether it's work related or otherwise. The data out there is pretty convincing when you're talking about that type of issue. This national study of mental health and wellbeing that was done in July 2022 talks to there being over 2 in 5 Australians in that 16 to 85 year age bracket experiencing some kind of mental disorder at some time in their life. Now that's to 1 in 2 people, and we're talking not necessarily things at the highest end of the scale. It could be down that lower end of mild depression or anxiety types of issues, noting that by far and away anxiety type problems are the most common thing that people tend to have to deal with. So the notion that people just need to take a teaspoon of cement and harden up, that type of attitude isn't really going to fly, acknowledging that we're going to be dollars to dimes coming across people who are going to be having some sort of issue, work related or otherwise, and there's expectations that sit around that. From a business point of view, I mean, it is just good business to manage these things. Obviously, you want to avoid loss of productivity, disruption, turnover, or at the point end of the claim, the point end of the scale, claims, investigations, and penalties. Bearing in mind that when we talk about the regulation of these things from a legal sense, work health and safety issues are criminal offences. So if somebody suffers an injury at work, whether it's a physical injury or a mental health type of injury because of their work, then that's certainly open to the regulator to investigate and, if deemed serious enough, to prosecute, and that's a matter that goes before the courts as a criminal offence. So, and of course, the outcome can be penalties imposed. The other angle, of course, when it comes to employee claims, and as I've touched on that Stephen will talk to, is the workers' compensation, which we obviously see a lot of. Quite apart from that, Ben, if you just skip on to the next slide, just to indicate again another good reason why it is important to manage these things. There's been, again, in terms of studies in this space, and certainly this Safe Work Australia study that's been going since 2009, and what it highlights is that in organisations where there are low levels of management commitment to psychological health and safety, the workplace cost to that is enormous. So for Australian businesses, that's been estimated at $6 billion per annum. Now, that's not all businesses. The key part of that finding to take note of is those businesses with low levels of management commitment to psychological health and safety. So the message is pretty clear when you look at these sort of data. It's in those organisations where steps are not being taken. So those that embrace the idea of ignorance or apathy as their approach, they're the ones that are going to be having to deal with these issues and obviously facing claims and loss of productivity. I won't speak to the rest of the numbers there, but again, the data just highlights for us that not managing these things comes at an enormous cost at the back end. All right, so very quickly in terms of legal framework around these things, several ways that this has played out. There's been obviously forever and a day a series of work health and safety legislation, which you've had at all times a broad obligation if you're a person conducting a business or undertaking. So any company or sole trader owes this obligation to ensure the safety and health of your workers at work, and of course as well anyone else who might be affected by your business or undertaking is also looked after. So that statutory obligation forever and a day has been there. It's not limited to physical injuries. It's always been the case under the work health and safety laws that you've needed to manage psychosocial issues. The big shift, of course, is that we now have a more specific framework that sits around that. So in a sense, whilst this is not new, what is new is the direction and the framework that's being given to you now that you have to work within to make sure that you're hitting the mark. Other pieces of legislation, of course, also contribute to the matrix in terms of having to manage these types of issues, whether it's the Fair Work legislation or your awards or enterprise agreements that deal with things like, hours of work or other family-friendly, requirements that speak to, making sure that people have a work-life balance and are, not psychologically affected by their work. The workers' compensation laws, which talk to issues like having to make sure that you engage in reasonable management action in a reasonable way when you're dealing with your people to avoid or to defend claims, and the common law obligations that, again, have been there forever and a day to prevent foreseeable injury to your workers in terms of how you conduct your business. But speaking to specifically the work health and safety part, the key to remember, which I've just sort of summarised on the next slide for you, is just, as I say, that primary duty that you've got to ensure health and safety of workers and others who might be impacted by your work. We do have this new statutory obligation to manage psychosocial risks arising from psychosocial hazards, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But really, the base that we're talking about in this space is what are the things that might arise from your someone's having a fire alarm. So if you're dealing with your work or situations at work that might cause a stress response to people, then that's something that you are going to be expected to manage under the legislation in a more specific way. So if we look at how that's played out, typically in work health and safety law, if you go to the next slide, Ben, for me, we have at federal level Safe Work Australia, at a Commonwealth level, which deals with what people who are employed by the Commonwealth scheme are expected to do. Unlike employment issues more broadly, where the federal government decided to take over the field in that regard, they haven't done that with safety. So what happens is that for safety matters, the federal government will pass safety laws at Commonwealth level and then leave it to the states and territories to copy them as they see fit. And that's pretty much happened with most jurisdictions across Australia. I think really Victoria is the only outlier when it comes to how these things, in terms of not having the harmonised laws in place. But in 2022, what they did for dealing with these types of issues, and I suspect driven by a lot of the data that was coming through from those longitudinal studies showing the loss of productivity and the enormous cost to business for not managing these issues. And of course, we had this little thing called a pandemic, which, we're going to be, no doubt, for years afterwards, be studying the impacts of what the pandemic has had on people's health and well-being. And that really speaks to a need or desire from the government to say, right, well, we need to get serious about managing these issues now. How are we going to do it? And other states and territories are following suit. New South Wales were very, very early adopters. So this is not news for New South Wales in any way, shape or form, or shouldn't be. Tasmania coming on board, West Australia have come on board. Queensland, we kicked off ours on the 1st of April this year. Terrible date to pick for starting new laws of this nature. When you sort of say it starts on April Fool's Day, I think probably most safety professionals I know were telling people it starts after the end of March, just to make sure that people didn't think that this was a joke. And then Northern Territory later this year adopting the code as well. Slight difference in Queensland, which I'll speak to, but really sits around in Queensland and more of a need to adopt a risk management approach to these matters, which the other states and territories haven't adopted. But what's happened then is that relevant safety laws have been changed. So here in Queensland, we've inserted a new section in our regulation, specifically setting out what a psychosocial hazard is. So that's a hazard that arises from or relates to any one or more of the design or management of work, the work environment, plant at the workplace, or workplace interactions or behaviours that may cause psychological harm, whether or not they might also cause physical harm. So really, when you break it down and look at those elements, certainly in our view, a large part of the heavy lifting is going to need to be done around that first part about the design or management of work. because that's where I think we're going to see people needing to really look back and assess how is it, that we keep on doing work the same way and people end up with, making claims about their psychological health and well-being. There is a need to, sit back and say, well, should we be doing the same thing over and over again, or is there a better way of doing this that doesn't expose people to those kind of risks? And we'll speak to some of those, but by way of example, people who might, work remotely, for example. The other part of that that I think we'll see some work being done is around the interactions or workplace interactions or behaviours side of things, and that's because those issues have traditionally always been a HR issue. They're now also a work health and safety issue. So people are going to need to make sure that their work health and safety teams and their HR teams, when dealing with those interactions or behaviours, are really working together and making sure the left hand knows what the right hand is doing, because that's, talks to issues such as workplace bullying or sexual harassment. And so you are going to be expected to assess how it is that your people might be exposed to those sorts of behaviours in the workplace and how you're going to manage them. Now, ideally, people will already have been doing that because you've had to manage them as an employment issue forever and a day. And so in many respects, that shouldn't be new, but there's now a higher expectation of putting it into this being a psychosocial hazard. So you also need to risk assess it as a work health and safety issue as well. So it's really those two spaces. I'm not suggesting that work environment and plant at the workplace aren't also going to be things that obviously, because they're in the regulation, are going to need to be thought about. But those two parts of this test, I think, are where the rubber is really going to hit the road for a lot of businesses and where a lot of work is going to need to be done. So just to, and this is probably a good time for David to provide some commentary around, and David may well want to give some more commentary around the things I've already put forward, looking at it from a legal aspect. But one thing the codes talk to, and the diagram on the slide there does come directly from the codes. If you want to have a read of them, by the way, I do encourage you to do so. There is helpful detail in them. I think the Queensland version of it's 67 pages long. So a lot of guidance that sits in there. But this diagram, I think, is one that really recognises one of the bigger differences that we see between physical injuries versus psychosocial types of issues, and that is that this type of issue is not static. A psychosocial matter is one that people can be at one end of the scale or the other. They're healthy, they're happy, they're happy with life and work and everything that's going on. Or they might start drifting into those middle two categories of reacting deeper into struggling, and then, at the worst case, trending into having a psychological injury. And certainly what we're speaking to with people about is that need to make sure when you're dealing with these types of things that you see those middle two parts of reacting and struggling as being an opportunity, that being an opportunity to intervene and to do something about it. And this is where management of it, I think, is really going to need to happen. So I'll let David step in, and because I think David's got a lot more to say really about that continuum and things to think about in that space. So David, did you want to take over from there for a moment?
Sure, thanks, Cam. You're doing a good job, mate. Thank you. And you've given a good explanation as a bit of a start there for the continuum. So Ben, if you want to flick to the next slide. Cool. So in my time working with Mental Health First Aid Australia, since I've retired from playing sport, I've really enjoyed, I guess, giving a practical view on mental health, just acknowledging that for a long time, the conversation has been pretty stigmatized, right? When people are talking about mental health, they're usually talking about mental illness, and so much so that they think mental health means mental illness. They think that those two things mean the same thing, which is not the case. And mental health is best talked about as being on a continuum just like this. And as Cam touched upon there, it's really important to understand all parts of the continuum so that we learn when to intervene, when and how to intervene early to avoid people ending up in a crisis situation, requiring a psychological injury and having to be off work. So I always like to couple these conversations as well with physical health, because we all have physical health, just like we have mental health. Sometimes we can be physically healthy and sometimes physically unwell and physically ill and everything in between. And so it's much the same with our mental health. We can be mentally healthy at times and mentally ill, unwell at other times and everything in between. So this continuum really shows you that. And if we talk through different parts of the continuum, starting at the green end when we're mentally healthy, that includes things like normal mood fluctuations. So some days we'll be happy, excited, sad, angry, irritated, and that's no cause for concern. We all have those off days, up days, down days. So what we need to recognize, but is when that off day becomes a days, and then it becomes weeks as well as we slide further down that continuum. Also being healthy, we're performing well. That's at work. We're in control mentally, sleeping well, physically well, socially active, and we're not turning to substances or gambling or anything like that to cope. When we do become a little bit unwell, so that bad day or off day turns into a daze, they call that the reacting phase. And some of those symptoms might look like we're irritated and impatient, a bit nervous, overwhelmed, forgetful, sleep starts to suffer a little bit. We have the odd intrusive thoughts. Maybe our energy levels might suffer as well. Things like gambling, substance use, any of those other vices might start to creep into our lives as well as a bit of a temporary solution. As Cam mentioned, it's really important to notice these early warning signs in ourselves and other people because it gives us a chance to intervene and course correct. A course correction, as it sounds like, it's pretty simple, it's achievable, it's viable, done in limited time with limited resources. Because if we miss that reacting phase and slide further down the continuum, then those symptoms will intensify and we might get co-occurring symptoms as well, which will really interrupt our ability to come to work and perform our jobs. Some of those symptoms look like a negative attitude, anxiety, concentration, performance, sleep really start to suffer. We might get increased fatigue, pains in our joints, maybe avoidance of coming to work, certain tasks or duties or people at work, or of course, social situations as well. And that substance use, gambling and the like really starts to increase and it's hard to control. Sliding further down the continuum, those symptoms really intensify to a point that we're in crisis. They could be really debilitating and disabling for people. Some of those symptoms look like angry outbursts and aggression, really excessive anxiety, potentially to the point of having a panic attack. Concentration, behavior, sleep really starts to suffer and become a struggle. We're constantly fatigued, not socializing, and we might even have thoughts of suicide. So it's best to look at mental health as a whole like that and understand, I guess, what you might feel or other people might feel along different parts of that continuum and recognize that this is like a living document. Our mental health, our mood, it will move up and down this continuum throughout different periods of our life. We might have some strict deadlines at work, a massive project on the line, and we really start to struggle. We might be going through some family, social issues, and we really start to struggle. So it's important to recognize where you, your team sit on this continuum and do those small course corrections if we can, and or reach out for that professional help when we start to slide down that red zone of the continuum. So we're back a bit later to talk about stress and performance, but otherwise I'll throw back to you now, Cam.
Great, thanks, David. And just to on that course correction side of things, it is incredibly important. And we see this all the time with managing really any issue when it comes to your workers, because the sooner you intervene, the gap between where their performance needs to be and where they are can be small. And the longer you leave it, and I'll go back to my starting theme of ignorance or apathy. If you let that drift, they get further and further away from that performance of where they need to be, and it gets harder and harder to do that course correct that David's mentioned. So it really is critical in this space to make sure people are aware of the importance of dealing with these things and jumping onto them early before they become a bigger problem than they need to be. And it's not just, we talk about the potential worst case scenarios, and I think David mentioned, for example, suicide ideation. This is a problem across blue collar and white collar industries. We've certainly seen in construction industry blue collar workers who struggle with their mental health for various reasons. Certainly one that comes to front of mind for me was a young apprentice who was bullied to the point where he took his own life. so workplace bullying where someone does that to themselves, again, that's a walk-up start to a prosecution under the work health and safety laws as they are now. Otherwise, we look at examples of what happened down in Sydney now, although this is under investigation, so a lot of heavy caveats around what you can say about it, but suggestions of an accountant there who was, working hard and again suffering from, alleged workplace bullying issues. Now, and that's a person who she left a work end of year function, went back to the office and took her own life. So, that's the very serious end of the scale, where people have devolved into absolute crisis. And again, that need for that early intervention, that continuum, is probably one of the most important parts to talk about in this space. Certainly, this diagram again helps you to understand, comes from the code, where you've got any one or more of those elements. Everyone loves a Venn diagram. It just highlights that it's not just one aspect necessarily that could lead to that stress response. Again, that highlighting that it's in this space where it's frequent or prolonged, or it could be a one-off severe event that then causes that psychological harm. And there we're talking about depression, anxiety, burnout, PTSD, or at that highest end of the scale, someone taking their own life. There could be associated physical harm. So certainly anxiety, for example, can lead to cardiovascular issues, or people having musculoskeletal issues, things like grinding teeth and the like. But it's the mental health side that's obviously the biggest part of that, even whether there's related physical issues or not. So just very quickly, if we just jump onto that next slide, and I don't want to speak too long about this, but just to highlight, here in Queensland, this is the thing that we're doing differently to everywhere else, and that is that we've embraced from the risk management code of practice the need to risk manage psychosocial issues. Even though other states and territories haven't specifically adopted this, it's probably the approach you need to be taking anyway, quite frankly, and that is, your 101 stuff that you would do with any other type of hazard in the workplace. That is your hazard identification. What are your known risks and controls? So doing that triaging process of, okay, well, we recognise that these are the types of things we've got in our workplace that might cause a psychosocial risk. What controls do we already have in place? Where are our gaps? What do we need to do to manage those? Put in place those controls, and then of course over time review and review those control measures. The ring around that emphasises the need for consultation with your workers when you're talking about how you go about managing this the same way you do for a physical risk. The other part of this that people forget to talk about is the words right at the middle of that, which is management commitment. And I'll circle back to, again, one of the very early comments I made around that productivity issue, and the fact that it was workplaces where there was no management control or desire from management to step in and make sure these things were being dealt with properly. The old adage we talk about, fish rots from the head down. This is a space where if you've got that ignorance or apathy happening at the highest level, at that management level, it's going to fall over. And this has been recognised in risk management forever and a day. So you really do need to get that C-suite buy-in, for those who are in control of the organisation, making sure that they understand the importance and are helping to drive this space, because otherwise it's doomed to failure. The other part of it, when it comes to managing risk, of course, is the hierarchy of controls. I won't spend too long talking about it. The hierarchy of controls tends to be a difficult one to apply in many respects when you're talking about psychosocial risks. What I would say, though, is that it's that first part about eliminating the risk that becomes incredibly important, because, again, when we're talking about work design and how we go about doing things, that, as I say, is where a lot of the heavy lifting will need to be done when you're talking about this topic. It is going back to the drawing board and looking at what you do and why you do it, and thinking about what the impacts of that can be, and do we need to do things in a different way? Because if you do that, you may well find that you'll eliminate the risk, or at the very least, be able to find controls that will help to minimise it. So, whilst, as I say, it's an uncomfortable fit in some respects, there are certainly aspects of this that will be very, very relevant when it comes to working out what you need to do to manage them successfully. We'll just go through, and these are next few slides are things that are taken from the code as being psychological hazards that are picked up and that you need to be conscious of. You are going to need to work out for yourselves, obviously, for your business, which of these are relevant and what you need to do to manage them. But role overload, I think, is probably the most common one that most organisations are going to have to confront. Certainly something that we deal with as a law firm, in the construction space. There's continual talk about the lack of bodies. Have you got a heartbeat? If so, you have a job. Seems to be part of the mantra at the moment. Because people are finding that they're trying to do too much, not enough time to get everything done that needs to be done. So when you're talking about these issues, and really it's a case of going, well, okay, people are complaining that they've got too much on, unachievable deadlines, or too many responsibilities, or our targets are out of reach, or we're doing frequent, difficult thinking type work. Well, when you're having those conversations or looking at that type of issue, it is important when you're thinking about how to manage that type of hazard for people, because that does cause stress, very obviously so. People use that word all the time when it comes to how's work? I'm really stressed at work. Well, what is going on? You do need to interrogate it if you're going to try to manage it. So it is about looking at, what is the problem? Is there actually too much work? Do we need to try to put more bodies at it? Or is it that we've got people who are micromanaging and creating issues? Or is it, poor delegation? And if we manage that better, then we wouldn't stress people out so much. Is it that we've got insufficient resources or expertise? So do we need to, skill up in this space? Or is it that we've got inconsistent utilization of team members? You'll have people who are, we like to identify as the workaholics, the person who always sticks their hand up. Well, no doubt they're the person always getting the work and always then being stressed. Well, do you need to have a think about that and work out, well, is there a better way to be allocating this work to avoid that becoming an issue? Or equally, maybe it's because someone's had an expanded role or have taken on fresh duties. And again, how have we managed that change, and how have we helped them to deal with that change in a way that hopefully manages to, avoid a stressful situation arising over time? Because again, over time, that's when they'll start getting onto that continuum of, becoming reactive, or, becoming at risk of having a psychological injury if you let it go on too long without doing something. The next slide is just some more issues. Role underload. Can I say, I don't know that I had too many people saying I'm so stressed because I don't have enough work to do, but it's in the code, and obviously people not having enough work can be stressful for them. Remote work, do have a think about that, particularly people who are in isolated situations away from family, fly in, fly out. Those are all risks that you need to think about. And people who might be, if they're a part of an emergency response team or having to deal with traumatic events, again, that all these things are in the code as potential issues that you need to think about, and whether there's, what you need to do to manage those sorts of risks for them. The next slide, just quickly, is again, flexible work arrangements. Another gift that COVID gave us. People working at home can be good for their work-life balance, but equally it can also be stressful, particularly again if they're isolated from the workplace, not getting the right instructions, being left adrift. And the other downside we saw from COVID was particularly those who were subjected to domestic violence because they were working from home in an environment where they were stuck with their abuser. So don't always assume that flexible work is a great thing, and you do need to have some balance, I think, around that. And there's certainly a lot of debate that will be had in that space over time, but again, it's an issue that needs to be managed. And then fatigue, the very obvious one, again, for your industry in particular, how you might help people to manage those sorts of issues, whether it's through your work scheduling, having breakouts or updates and information to make sure that people are kept on track without getting overly concerned about what's going on. Having those regular discussions around capacity, how are you traveling? Have we got too much on? Do we need to manage things in a different way? All part of, what you'd hope is normal consultation anyway. But again, fatigue, just an incredibly important one to manage. we jump on to the next slide. One thing just to highlight, there are some spaces, particularly where you might be dealing with people and then not necessarily your own internal people. I think we find this more where people are dealing with others, where there might be some aggro, and certainly on some sites that can arise for various reasons where hostilities ensue. Certain industries obviously face this all the time. You do have to factor in this as an issue, potential issue in terms of work. If your workers might be exposed to work environments where there's likely to be some form of aggression, you're expected to be managing that. There's obvious difficulties around that, but just to make sure that you do capture this as part of your thinking. Certainly a lot more important for those, for example, the South Australian case I've got there as the last example. That was one where community workers being sent out into the community dealing with people with mental health problems, and the fact that you can't control having to work in that environment, they nevertheless failed to manage that because there was a person who was having escalating behaviours that weren't reported on that led to a very bad assault on one of the workers. So as I say, don't expect that to be the case in your environment, but again, acknowledging if there is likely exposure to any form of violence or aggression, that's something you need to think about and put in place things to manage it. Just to quickly close out on a couple of other issues, making sure you've got your internal processes right around this. Do make sure you have pathways for people to raise it. That they're not always going to come to the boss necessarily if they've got an issue. So do make sure that you've got something in place to deal with this. Prioritise worker wellbeing, focus on minimising harm, and make sure that victims are looked after through the process is really the key message in that space. The next issue, just to quickly mention, is about non-work related psychological injury, because people again keep on saying to us, well, what do we do about someone who's got issues in their personal life? Are we expected to manage that for them? Short answer, no. Your job is not to make people better, but equally, your job is to not make it worse. So if someone discloses that they've got issues, you do need to factor that in terms of how they're dealt with in the workplace, but you're not expected to, make inquiries of people to say, or do you have a psychological issue because of things going on in your personal life, and how can we help manage your personal life? That's not where the line is drawn in this. Your responsibility is only for work-related issues and managing those. So hopefully that provides a level of clarity around that. I'll quickly just talk about duty of officers, bearing in mind because of the work health and safety laws, there is a need for people at that management level, as I've talked about before, to be involved in dealing with these things, but it is about making sure there's sufficient resources to deal with these things, that you have considered what the risks are, and that you've got those reviews in place to make sure that they are effective. And when you're making decisions about the workplace, do so with these types of issues front of mind, perhaps in a way that you maybe necessarily haven't done so in the past. So where you're doing regional deployments, do we need to think about the isolation or exposure of female workers to sexual harassment in those types of environments, for example? Your recruitment processes, how do we go about managing this through that process? If you're engaged in change management, introducing new things or reorganising the workplace, again, managing psychosocial issues is something that needs to be on the table. And again, busy periods, which is the very common one, I think, at the moment, and how we're going to make sure that people are looked after as best we can through this process. It's not about eliminating it necessarily, but it's about how best can we manage it to reduce the risk as much as we can. I won't talk about the next slide. I think you're going to talk about the warning signals, Stephen, as part of your presentation, but again, I've talked about the need to make sure you've got ways of picking this up so you can manage it. You can't manage what you don't know, but just flagging that there are a whole range of things that your people will be told, or that your middle management, for example, might pick up that can be passed on. Incredibly important that it's recognised that where people are having encountering unusual behaviours from people, or those conversations with saying the obvious stuff like I'm stressed or I'm burnt out, or that there's something going on in their personal life, a bereavement or a divorce or something of that nature that they're bringing to work. You need to maybe just make sure that doesn't spill over into the workplace. Are there things going on that we can identify, and gives you that opportunity to jump in. And then finally, close to finally for me, what managers need to do. There's this expectation. Ben, it's just on the next slide. What are the main risks that people are exposed to? What have we done to eliminate, reduce, or manage them? And if you're a leader in the organisation, you do have that responsibility to make sure that you're not making things worse. As I say, your role is not to make things better, or to fix people, but your role is certainly to make sure that work isn't going to make them worse than they are. And that work design part is, don't just keep on doing the same thing and expecting a different result. Make sure people have those pathways, they know how to use them. Take action when those issues, obvious issues, are arising. And if someone does go through it, make sure you've got that rehab process in place for helping them to recover. And then finally, before I pass on to Stephen very quickly, is just to flag that do be mindful, as I say, how investigations of these things are going to be conducted. If you create reports for these things, typically in work health and safety matters, we can do reports under privilege. That doesn't apply to reports created that then become subject to a work cover claim. Any reports you create can be discoverable in a work cover claim, so be careful about that. How do you manage notifiable incidents? If someone is hospitalised with a mental health injury caused by work, that has to be notified to work health and safety to investigate. So make sure you've got processes that pick up when that notification needs to occur. And then, as I've talked about before, get your teams structured to manage it. Make sure your HR and work health and safety teams talk together, because there are now those particular issues around harassment and bullying that are traditionally employment relations issues that are now also a safety issue. All right. I'll pass on to Stephen to deal with the workers' comp side.
Thanks very much, Cam. That's great. Morning, everyone. It's good to see so many online. This is a really important topic. I work in the insurance team at McCullough Robertson, and one of the things that I do is to deal with a lot of psychosocial workers' compensation claims on behalf of employers. Cameron's talked about the new codes that have come into force in relation to managing those issues, and he's talked about the potential for those to lead to prosecutions against parties who fail to comply with those laws. Because those laws are relatively new, we're still yet to sort of see how that's going to play out in terms of what matters are likely to be prosecuted and what the appetite of those prosecutors is to pursue those claims. That's not what we're seeing in the workers' comp space. Particularly since COVID, we've seen a significant uptick in the level of claims activity in this space. Insurers talk about what's called tort temperature, and what that means is that it relates to the regularity of claims of a particular class. And I can tell you that in my space, I've seen quite a lot of activity in this psychosocial area. And in fact, in the last couple of weeks, I've received 6 new matters where employers want to appeal against or respond to workers' compensation claims relating to psychosocial risk. And so that's why what we've done is we've combined this presentation, or I've combined my workers' compensation presentation with Cameron's presentation. And it's also good to have David along as well, because his focus is really on recognising these issues and putting in place practical solutions to prevent these sort of issues getting out of hand. So what I want to do is just explain to you the rules of engagement for workers' compensation, starting with some key concepts. Now, typically, workers' compensation has two aspects to it. One is called compensation, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. And the other aspect to it is what's called common law damages. Now, compensation is a no-fault scheme. So in other words, the entitlement of an injured worker to compensation does not depend on the fault of the employee or the employer. All that has to be established is that there has to be an injury, and in this case we're talking about psychological injury. That injury has to arise in the course of employment. So in other words, it has to be work-related. And the employment must be a significant or substantial contributing factor. So Cameron's talked about situations where somebody might have some problems in their personal life. If that was the only cause of somebody's psychological injury, then the employment wouldn't be a significant or a substantial contributing factor. But you can have a situation where somebody is suffering mental health issues partly because of their work and partly because of personal issues. Now, usually what happens is they get sent off to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and it is the job of that assessor to work out whether the employment is a significant or a substantial contributing factor. Now, there are categories of claims where an entitlement to compensation is excluded, and Cameron's touched on that, and it's in circumstances where the injury arises out of reasonable management action taken in a reasonable way. Now, that's a concept that I could do a separate presentation on if I needed to, but essentially, not everything is management action. So management action has to relate to the substance of the employment relationship. So an example of management action would be something to do with somebody getting a promotion or not getting a promotion. It could be to do with disciplinary proceedings. It could be to do with performance management. So in other words, it has to go to the substance of the employment relationship before you can get it within the realms of management action. And even then, as I say, it has to be reasonable management action taken in a reasonable way. So you can take management action, but if you take that management action in an unreasonable way, well, then there will still be an entitlement to compensation. Ben, next slide, please. Typically, when claims arise, my first piece of advice to clients is to get on it quick smart, because there are appeal pathways, and they're up on the screen. They're the main pathways. I think there should be another one coming up for Victoria as well. And there's a number of these commissions and tribunals throughout all of the states and territories where these claims are dealt with. Now, ideally, you don't really want to be there because it's fairly expensive to be in those tribunals. Your insurance won't cover the cost of appealing against a decision which you don't agree with. And so the best thing to do, particularly with these psychosocial claims, is get on them early and respond to the insurer and have your say. Now, you're entitled to do that. The other thing I'd say is these claims are very time consuming. They will take you away from your core business in order to respond to them, because they are very detail heavy. So it's really important that you, if you need some assistance with it, that you get some at an early juncture. And often if the claim is unmeritorious, and I'm not saying they all are, but if it is, then they can be headed off at the pass at an early stage. Next slide, Ben. Now, I've talked about compensation, and I've also mentioned common law damages. Now, most people will be familiar with the concept of owing a duty of care to their employees. Now, that duty of care does relate to preventing psychosocial injuries with one other qualification, which I'll deal with. But in order to establish an entitlement to common law damages, there has to be proof of negligence. So in other words, the employer has to have done something wrong. They have to have breached their duty of care in some way. And that breach has to have caused the psychological injury. So if you can get all those ducks in a row, or the claimant can, well, then there's an entitlement to common law damages. Now, common law damages varies from state to state. There are some restrictions on what you can claim in some states, notably New South Wales. There's significant limits on access to damages there. But in a lot of other states and territories, those limitations are not as significant. Ben, next slide, please. But as I say, in order to get access to common law damages, the touchstone or the gateway through which a claimant has to proceed is that the injury has to be foreseeable. So in other words, it's not just any psychological injury that can attract an entitlement to damages. The employer has to foresee that that injury might occur. Now that is potentially difficult for employers because obviously none of us on this call that I'm aware of are psychologists or psychiatrists. None of us are experts in that field. None of us are mind readers. And as David's mentioned earlier, there has been a bit of a stigma around some of these issues. And so what you've got to look for are what the courts call evident signs. And I've given a bit of a list there. So things like unexplained time off, prolonged periods of working long hours, changes in behaviour, excessive alcohol or prescription medication consumption. In fact, I think that's probably a good juncture for me to hand over to David to talk about that, because I'm looking at it from a legal perspective, but I'm sure is much more adept than I am in terms of identifying those evidence signs. So Ben, next slide, please.
Cool. Thanks for that, Stephen and Ben. And just linking together a few of the things that Cam said, Stephen said, and that I'll say now. We've heard things like early warning signs, taking on too much, so overload. We've heard of underload as well, which kind of feels like a nice thing, I guess, but we want to talk about the dangers of that here in a sec. We've heard the words fatigue, those early warning signs of I'm burnt out. So there's some of the things you've seen on Cam's and Stephen's slides. So what we'll talk about now is how stress or pressure, I've got pressure down the bottom there, and you could use the words pressure, stress, anxiety, alertness, arousal. You can use any of those words interchangeably. They all kind of mean the same thing. What we're going to look at is how pressure and stress impacts performance. Now, you might find interesting that it's the second day of camp for the Maroons today. And in my experience going into those camps as a player, I can tell you that on the first day of camp, they would have done a range of health assessments on the players. There'll be some self-scoring ones around their motivation, their emotional health, and so on. And there'll be some more like digitally recorded ones from apparatuses. There'll be a jump test, there'll be a grip strength test, heart rate variability test, amongst other things. And if you've heard of this stuff before, it's really just measuring their stress levels. That's what it's about. And they want to know how stressed the boys are so they can get in front of it throughout this week. They can address any key issues so that any red flags don't, I guess, show themselves training during the week, or even worse, in the game next Wednesday night. So they want to get in front of this, monitor their stress, regulate it throughout the rest of the week. And getting back to the diagram, what we know about stress, pressure, anxiety versus performance is that it impacts it a lot, in that if we look down the bottom left-hand corner of that graph, when pressure, stress is very low, you can see performance is also low. They call it the bore-out zone, where you're underwhelmed, underloaded. You don't know what you're doing, how to do it, why to do it. Everything's a real effort for you, an uphill battle. But conversely, on the right-hand side of that graph, when pressure, stress, arousal is really high, you can see once again, performance is low again. So like the burnout zone, or and we've been there for a long time. A lot of people refer that as the zone of delusion. And when we're in that zone, we struggle to concentrate, we struggle to make decisions and to think clearly and focus. So achieving our day-to-day tasks at work are a real struggle. So if we can regulate our stress well, in that we pull back on stress if it's very high and we're burnt out, or we push up that stress, motivation and pressure if we're really in the bore-out zone, then we can get into the middle there, which is the stretch zone. And that's where we achieve optimal performance. You can see performance is really high there. Pressure is moderate to high. So you're not in your comfort zone. You're not just going through the motions day to day, but you're also not strained continuously as well day to day. You're just in a bit of a stretch where you've got enough work to sustain you, to keep you occupied and motivated, but not too much that you're overwhelmed. You can pay attention to the quality of what you're doing, take care with it, and make sure it's of a high standard. When we get in that stretch zone, We call it the flow state. We're in the zone where we're immersed in what we're doing. We have a lot of enjoyment out of that, quality's there, and time just seems to fly by. When we're in the bore-out zone or the burnout zone, time drips by incredibly slowly, and it's an uncomfortable place to be in. So regulating our stress, very important that we get in that optimal performance zone. I'll throw back there to Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. That's really useful. Yeah, so just coming back to some of the legal principles. What I've done here is I've talked about some in the scope under the heading scope of duty. There, I've talked about some common scenarios that I see that are problematic, and they keep recurring in the claims that I receive instructions on. Workload scenarios. I mean, by and large, as Cameron and David have mentioned, what you see is overload scenarios when we're talking about workload, but you can have, and I have had situations where somebody gets stressed because they don't have enough work to do, and they start worrying about their job security and those sort of things. So that has to be kept in mind. Disciplinary issues and processes. Now, this is a pretty hot one because self-evidently, if you're if you're taking disciplinary action against somebody, it's very stressful for them, and it can be stressful for you as an employer. It leads to, or can lead to, a significant level of disputation. In fact, though, usually you don't owe a duty of care in relation to the way you discipline somebody, because the courts have said that that's an exception to the element of duty of care. Performance management is one where there can be, and there have been and can be claims. Performance management has to be done fairly and in good faith. So in other words, you can't blame the employee for something that's not their fault. The other one I've come across fairly often is compliance with policy. So a lot of employers will have policies and procedures that deal with workload scenarios, discipline and performance management. Often you see in the claim space is what you see is, if as an employer you don't comply with those policies, you can be criticised for that. Generally, you don't owe a duty of care to comply with your own policies, although that can inform the scope of your duty that you owe to someone. The other big point to make is that it's critical to provide support. So again, what I see is when these disciplinary processes are started, sometimes employers forget to or overlook the need to provide support to people. Now, that can be through employment assistance programs, or it can just be having a support person in a meeting. If those standards are observed properly, then that can go a long way to preventing claims from arising. Next slide, Ben. So these are the key takeaways. As I've said before, the frameworks for compensation and common law damages are different. Compensation is no fault. Common law damages is dependent upon proof of negligence, as I've outlined. Reasonable management action is not a catch-all defence to claims. In other words, you can't defend a claim simply by saying, well, what I did was reasonable and it was management action. That will apply in some circumstances, but not all. As I've said, claims are complex and difficult to defend. They will take you away from your core activities. And so if you need legal support, it's important to get that support early. The scenarios to be mindful of are excessive workloads or too little workload, investigating misconduct. That's I've had lots of claims dealing with that issue, and performance management. So all of those things are relatively obvious. And so if you find yourself in that situation, stop and think about it and plan how you're going to manage it. That's all from me. But I think what we want to do now is hand back over to David, because he's got some sports stories or war stories that he'd like to share with us. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Stephen. And I won't keep you guys too much longer, but one thing we talk about with this new compliance, these new policies and procedures is I'd hate to think we just see it as a chore, as more red tape to cut through, as more procedures day to day. I see it as a real opportunity. Cam mentioned earlier that the organisations who invest money and time into wellbeing, they're the ones that mitigate risk the best. They have the lowest claims. And similarly, I was having a great conversation with the NRL Wellbeing Department recently, and they revealed that of the top 6 clubs last year that spent the most money and time on well-being, 4 of them were actually the top 4 in the NRL. So of the top 6 spenders and investors in the space, 4 were actually the best performers in the whole comp. And so I see it as a real opportunity. And during my time playing in the NRL, there's a huge shift in how we viewed mental health. There's a huge shift in how we trained. It went from this dark and gloomy, stigmatized topic to one that was actually refreshingly positive, proactive, that we invested in daily because we wanted to feel and perform our best. Our training schedules changed from just coming to training 5 minutes before we started, running on the field and training, and then leaving again. It changed from that to getting there an hour early and then staying an hour late. We get there an hour early to do all these prehab exercises to activate muscles and strengthen muscles. And we do recovery as well for an hour to get ourselves ready for the next day. And that was all about reducing the risk of soft tissue injuries and also improving performance. Now, when all these changes got made, everyone was like, oh, more hours in a day we have to spend doing this. Give us a break. You're just trying to make life hard for us, as you could expect. But when I first started playing, the average player averaged 4 games per year in the NRL. 4 games in the whole career in the NRL. Just 4 games was the average amount that players played in the whole career. They retired around the age of 28, 29, maybe 30. But thanks to all these changes, these precautionary changes, risk mitigation strategies, by the time I finished playing, players were playing to 34, 36, 37 years old. And the average amount of games was up around 65, 70. And so as a result of these precautionary strategies and buying into it, we got to play for more years, do what we enjoy at a higher level, and earn more money as a result. So I'm sure all of us want that out of our workplaces, whether we're running the business and we want more out of our staff, a higher performance with less risk, or if we're a staff member, we want to come into a workplace, enjoy ourselves, perform our best, and be there for the long term to maximize our careers, not have to leave because something might happen. So I just wanted to share that. It's not all about just compliance and a headache. It's also, I think, around a good opportunity as well. Over to you,
Thanks,
Ben.
David. Thanks, David. Thanks, Cameron. Thanks, Stephen. I'm conscious of time. We set an hour aside for today, but did anyone have any questions that we can pose to the 3 gentlemen we've heard from today? Okay, no worries. Well, look, with that, I'll wrap things up. Of course, I want to say a big thank you to Cameron, Stephen, and David, and their organisations, McCullough Robertson Law Firm and Prime Effect. We've had a pretty long relationship with McCullough Robertson now, who have helped us out over several years on everything from today's topic in industrial manslaughter to contract conditions, payment terms, and things like that. And so we're very grateful for that relationship. So thanks, guys. And David, Prime Effect is something that we've just begun. We're looking forward to doing more with you guys. In fact, later this year, excuse me, we'll be working with Prime Effect on our National Safe Work Month campaign, where hopefully we can delve a little bit more into those sort of proactive strategies that unlock not just obviously the risk mitigation side that we've heard about today, but also the productivity and performance side, which I know every business could do with some more of. For everybody who's attended today, we will be providing a certificate of attendance. If you would like that, we'll try and get that out to you sort of by the end of the week. And the other thing that we're sort of doing in this space too is looking at revising our workplace health and safety management manual, just to make sure that it's keeping time with the latest requirements in this space. It's something we try and do anytime something new is released in the workplace health and safety area. So keep an eye out for some announcements there. Thank you once again to everyone for coming. We appreciate your time, and we hopefully will see you soon. Oh, sorry. And the final thing is we'll be sending the slides out as well. I've had a couple of people ask for that already. So we'll get that in your inbox in the next day or so. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.